Between $1,500 and $2,500, there's a lot of competition. There are a ton of brands that compete on similarly spec'd watches. The reason? Bracelets, cases, dials, they're all sourced and brands sourced from a lot of the same manufacturers. So most watches in this space end up being very similar in terms of quality, specs, and pricing. But Formex is a little bit different, and it shows. I've had hands-on for a couple of weeks with the Reef and the Essence models. These are some really nice watches, and I have the controversial opinion that they should cost more. Let's dive in. Formex kindly allowed me to borrow two watches for review, the Reef and the Essence. The Essence is among the most popular Formex watches and is a sport-forward, date and time-only sports watch in the vein of the Aquaterra and the Nomos Club Sport. The watch is 39 millimeters, it has a height of 10 millimeters and a lug to lug of 45 millimeters. The lug width is 20 millimeters. The watch is water resistant to 100 meters. The movement inside is a high grade Solita, which is fully COSC certified. It's got 41 hours of power reserve. The case itself has this ingenious little suspension system which is designed to absorb shocks to protect the movement from impact and also to add a little bit of give to the watch when wearing it. You'll sometimes notice that the inner case lifts a little when you flex your wrists, which actually does make a noticeable difference on the wearing experience. The Reef comes in 39.5 and 42 millimeter sizing. It's got a height of 11 millimeters. The lug width is 22 millimeters and they have respectively a lug to lug of 45.5 and 49.5 millimeters. The Reef has a depth rating of 300 meters and again you get a fully COSC certified chronometer grade movement inside, this time with 56 hours of power reserve. The key party feature on this watch is the interchangeable bezels. Formex allows you to choose which bezel you want. You can also buy different bezels and interchange them yourself, and it gives you the option to further customize your watch. For both watches, you get an easy change mechanism for the bracelet. The Reef has a regular clasp with micro adjustment, and the Essence I tried had a butterfly clasp that did not have a quick adjustment mechanism. Aesthetics are subjective. Some people like the look of a Panerai Luminor case, some people don't. To some, the oyster case of a Rolex is a bit bland, and to others, it's the epitome of refinement. These two watches are, from my perspective, good looking. My favorite of the two is the Reef. I'm partial to divers generally, but the thing that I really dig about the Reef is, well, a lot of things. The case is faceted and it has an angular case, unlike, something you get from Monta or Tudor or Rolex or Longines. A lot of brands tend to go for more rounded designs, but Formex has chosen this more angular look that I find really appealing, and it also sets them apart. Sometimes brands go overboard and use this kind of angular design in oversized watches. Think of Zenith Defies and Defy Extremes, but Formex doesn't go overboard. The bracelet is perfectly matched to the case and the dial is stunning. This watch looks the business, and especially because of the height, which is thinner than anything you get from Tudor or Omega, it wears like a dream. The Essence, although not my favorite of the two, is also good looking. The Essence also has elements of that angular case design that you find on the Reef. There's a little bit more polish and a little bit more shine to this watch because it's positioned as the Aquaterra or Nomos Club Sport kind of competitor. So it's got highly polished bezel flanks and a brushed top surface. At 4 positions around the bezel, you have these screws that hold the case suspension system into place. Because they are hex type screws, you don't get the opportunity to complain about the screws not being aligned. Those 4 hex screws are part of the design language for the watch, and it is what sets it apart from Aquaterras and Datejosts, but it's not my personal favorite. The bracelet again is matched to the case and suits it brilliantly. It has 3 downsides though. As mentioned, it doesn't have an easy adjust mechanism. Because it's a butterfly clasp, you don't get the flexibility that you get from a regular closing mechanism. Second, the circular release buttons to deploy the clasp are a little bit too big and stick out too much from the clasp. It's a minor thing, but they do seem to flare out too much from the bracelet. And finally, and this is a super nitpicky thing, but the individual center links of the deployment are different lengths and it just breaks the continuity of the bracelet. They could do well to fix that. For both models, you get super well executed dials. The Essence model I had a color matched date wheel and a small slope on either side of the date window and etched grooving on the dial. The Reef again has a color matched date wheel and a fume sunray look to it that works incredibly well. In both watches, the hands and markers are well balanced and just generally have a very premium look. Like I said, I quite like these watches. My controversial statement was that these watches should cost more. and this is likely going to get some people riled up, and I expect the following 3 comments under the video. 1, you're a shill, they're paying you. 2, they are overpriced and I can get something from brand X that is much better and much cheaper. And 3, you can get something in China or Taiwan to make a watch exactly like this for half the price. Let's address those 3 potential comments. No one is paying me. I have not received any gifts, I have not received any payments, any gratuities, and I don't keep the watch. My opinion is my own. I could honestly not care less if you buy these watches or not, and there is no promo code below that gets me a kickback. So just forget about the silly claims. Now to the second comment, and here we have to dive into who Formex are. Formex was started as a Kickstarter micro brand some years back. Their lead guy, among others, is Rafael Granito, who is their CEO. That's not the important part. The important part is that Rafael and his family own a company called Dexel. Who are Dexel? Dexel is a Swiss component manufacturer that makes cases and bracelets for high-end watch brands. The brands? Well, they make this case. That's a Hublot. They make this bracelet. That's a Girard-Perregaux. Do you recognize this case? Or this one? If you have a quick release bracelet on your Longines Spirit, you'll likely find similarities with those found on a Formex. In their broader network, they also have a stake in a company called Cadranor. Cadranor makes dials. High-end dials. Cadranor aren't quite as open as Dexel about who they make their dials for, but suffice it to say they make dials that go into some pretty high-end watches. Now, Dexel doesn't just sell to Formex. They sell to a whole lot of other brands, but there are a couple of mechanisms at play here. First is the fact that because of the close relationship between Dexel, Cadranor and Formex has the opportunity to closely specify their needs to a much higher extent than brands in a similar price point that also might want to buy something from Dexel. They live in the same building, and going down and trying out an idea is possible for them in a way that isn't open to a lot of other brands that have a more formal sourcing relationship. 2, my guess is Formex can get hold of some of the better stuff, the better dials, the better spec finishings that are maybe out of reach from a lot of other brands in this space. And maybe, just maybe, there's a family discount. More importantly, there's engineering at play here. I've worked with a lot of different companies and I've had a lot of different CEOs. And the thing that I've always noticed is how the CEO's background affects how a product is approached. So a businessman and management consultant CEO will approach product strategy and product innovation in one way. CEOs with a background in production and engineering approach product strategy in a different way. Just think of Audemars Piguet and their outgoing CEO. What was he? He was a marketing and sales guy. And you can't deny that his background shaped AP's focus on marketing and branding much more than product. The guys behind Formex aren't engineers, but there's an experience with production and engineering that shows in the product. There has been an active choice to buy the best possible Sellita, the one that would pass a COSC certification. The choice to make an interchangeable bezel on the reef is not a simple one. Making a watch where the bezel aligns is hard. Making bezels that are interchangeable and ensuring that all of them align is even harder. That's a decision that requires an understanding of production and the costs associated with that complexity. This model that you see on the website is a meteorite dial with gold plating. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to Google how many other watches you can think of that have a meteorite dial with gold plating. I won't even limit you to the sub $2,500 price point. The suspended case mechanism for the Essence is not useful to me, and it feels like a party feature. But do you know what it does? It adds a significant amount of manufacturing complexity to that case. Milling a block of steel is one thing. Milling 2 blocks of steel and building a mechanism to connect the 2 adds complexity, and that means added cost. There's the quick release system. There's the easy adjust. There are tons of these production and engineering forward decisions that without a doubt make for a more complex watch and a more expensive to produce watch. There are very few places where Formex cuts production corners. There are enough engineering and production decisions that drive up the cost of this watch that indicates to me that they could probably sell it at a higher cost if they wanted the same margins as everyone else. This is where we get to the classic "you can get it cheaper and just as good from China" statement. The short answer is that's absolutely ridiculous. You can't find the combination of COSC level meteorite dial, custom quick release, suspension case and interchangeable bezel from some Chinese manufacturer. you can't get the total experience. Some individual elements may be able to be replicated, but not the whole. That watch doesn't exist yet. Could somebody in China polish a case as well as Formex? Sure, but boiling quality down to who polishes a case best is just too simplistic. Would this watch be cheaper if less of the work was done in Switzerland? Absolutely. Salaries are higher in Switzerland. Business costs and regulatory costs are higher. And could a Chinese manufacturer over time learn to do all of what Formex and company can do? For sure. There's nothing that inherently hinders a Chinese manufacturer in doing something of the same quality if they wanted to. In a couple of years, I'm sure you'll start to see more and more manufacturers popping up in the Far East with higher and higher production values. And yes, over time, it will more and more be more of a question of who has the most appealing aesthetic and which brands manage to capture your imagination, and not so much whether it's made in Switzerland or China. Until then, you can make up your mind whether all those engineering details are worth it to you compared to a technically overall lesser Asian product. But then that's a personal stance. Is it fair that Formex and Dexel have this symbiosis? Well, it's a business. It's not a question of fair or unfair. They still have to pay for what they want to get a hold of. And this is far from a unique setup. Kinesi functions in a similar way for Tudor. Kinesi makes movements for Tudor, but Breitling, Chanel, and Norqain also benefit from Kinesi movements. Tudor likely gets the good stuff too, just like Formex potentially could. Same goes for the entire Swatch group. There's a lot of cross-pollination in the Swatch group, and it's not just limited to their ETA movements. The same goes for Seiko, that sell components to other brands under different labels with different quality levels. As for Girard-Perregaux and Hublot and whoever else that buys from Dexel, well, I'm sure they could make a deal with Dexel to not sell certain components if they wanted exclusivity. Dexel would just do it under the condition of a given price and a given volume for a given period of time. So it's not unique to Formex or unfair in any way. My channel isn't about convincing you to buy one watch or the other. I honestly couldn't care less what you spend your money on. I've got this channel to talk about watch-related things that interest me, and I enjoy seeing things from different perspectives. When someone says this is too expensive, I try to pick apart and understand the statement and the assumptions underlying it. When I say this watch should cost more, it's not from a perspective of me wanting some brand to make more money. It's based on trying to understand how the industry operates, how the actors are connected, and what it means for us as a consumer. For me, Formex is fascinating as a company because the way they are connected to suppliers makes them a kind of sort of hybrid in-house manufacturer. Tudor and Rolex and Omega make a point of emphasizing the in-house nature of their business. The fact that they can have their own foundry, mill their own parts, test their own components gives them an initial higher investment, but over time it allows them to refine and customize their products to the quality levels that they want to achieve. In my years in business, the question of insourcing was always a discussion of greater control and greater flexibility on one hand versus higher investments, higher business complexity, and higher risks on the other. If you are fully in-house and nobody buys your watches, you are going to burn through cash much faster than if you source your components from someone else. If you've ever wondered why some brands like Zelos potentially sell out so quickly, it's because likely they almost produce to order and therefore mitigate the risk of having stuff on the shelves that never ends up getting sold. That's the flexibility you have when you source. When you have your whole factory, it might as well be up and running. A lot of the other brands in this space are much more dependent on sourcing agreements, and it shows. They can't have everything as they want it. Sometimes they have to compromise on a feature because it would drive up cost too much. Sometimes they just don't have access to the feature that they would ideally like. Formex, I think, is a great illustration of the benefits of having a more closely linked value chain relationship. I massively enjoy this price point because there's so much on offer. But I also get a little bit jaded because a lot of watches more or less converge on the same qualities and features. It gets a bit repetitive. That's why I enjoy diving into these two Formex watches, because of the nature of their business model, and it gives them some different options that to me at least seem to be advantages over quite a few of their competitors. It also gave me another perspective on how these little marvels on our wrists get made. It illustrated to me the advantages of the journey some brands take from out of house to in-house, and how that journey affects your options as a customer. Whether or not you want one of these watches is entirely up to you. The aesthetic is to my tastes, for others it might not be, that's personal. When looking at the pure production quality of these watches, they are objectively of a very high standard. They have an engineering and production forward quality to them. Overall, I think it translates into a value add for the customer. And yes, I think they could charge a little bit more for these watches. If you feel they're overpriced for what you value, then that's fine. At the end of the day, the value that is assigned and the desirability something has is always personal. You like what you like, and I appreciate what I appreciate. Buy what makes you happy, and I hope you found this video interesting. Share your thoughts about Formex in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.